These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? Paris isn't simply the capital of France, it is the artistic capital of the world. For centuries, this city has been a kind of buzzing hive of the West's cultural and artistic development, home to thriving communities of go-ahead artists and some of the world's most important artworks. Amidst the hustle of Paris, art is everywhere. Good art, not so good art. But there is one modestly sized gallery hiding something sensational. The Musée de l'Orangerie, built as a hothouse for oranges and lemons, holds one of the most extraordinary works that has ever been made. These rooms are the Sistine Chapel of Impressionism, and these are Claude Monet's Water Lilies. I've come here again and again, and I've been moved to tears almost every time. No artist had ever attempted to capture the rippling, heartbreaking evanescence of life like this, and no one has come close ever since. It's a 360-degree immersion into the glittering waterscape of a different and a better world. There are 8 of these huge, curved panels, and standing in this room, you are surrounded by them. It is an almost hallucinatory feeling. You have different moods and colors of the sky, wind scudding across the water, different times of the day. And it's very hard to know how close to stand to these pictures as well, because to really see any of them, you have to go to the far side of the room and look back from a long distance. And yet, to properly understand them, you almost need your nose rubbing up against the canvas so that you can see the blistered, scrumbled, erupting and falling effect of Monet's extraordinary paintwork, the fruit of many, many decades of arduous study. These were the last works Monet produced, working relentlessly for 12 years. With them, he created a vision of life that still speaks clearly over a century after his oil paint first dried. More than 1 million people come into these rooms for that sense of serenity, and they walk out feeling calm and serene and reassured about the world, which is exactly not the story of the origin of the pictures. Behind these giant canvases, there lies a story of personal tragedy, of a brutal war, and a tormented man with a final, insatiable obsession. Claude Monet was born in Paris in 1840. His father wanted him to go into the family grocery business, but it wasn't for Monet.
He spent a lot of time out of doors, which is what fueled his passion for nature. And he was a brilliant caricaturist, and he was always, as a young age, drawing people.
Monet was a rebel right from the start, a man destined to change French painting forever. Using new, industrially made, easy-to-carry paints, he developed a fresh way of painting outside, trying to snatch fast-changing light and colour. Like an athlete against the clock, he worked with a frantic urgency, desperate to catch a moment before it vanished forever.
He would go out to the riverbank, set up and begin capturing very quickly the scene that he saw in front of him, catching the interplay between light and shadow, capturing how the light changed and getting this very immediate image.
He was concerned with visual sensation, something that is almost an emotional response to a scene.
But this style of painting ran counter to the art establishment around him.
You see the type of painting that was in fashion, very grand, serious, that today we dismiss as bordering on the sentimental.
Painters were still doing mythological scenes or doing scenes from the Bible or from French national history, Joan of Arc, for example. And there was an appeal for painters to paint modern life. Monet really was the one who maybe took it to the next level.
In 1874, Monet and a like-minded group of hairy young radicals had their first exhibition to showcase this new artistic movement.
Monet's contribution was a beautiful painting entitled Impression: Sunrise.
It was a dawn scene of fishing boats in the harbor, and he did it very quickly, probably painted it in the course of a morning or even less than that.
It does just give a suggestion of what's happening. The shadow of the boats on the water, so different from everything that had gone before.
But unfortunately for Monet, who was struggling to provide for his young family, the reviews of the exhibition were utterly damning.
Most people thought they were sketches made in preparation for something that was going to come after.
There is shock, surprise, hostility.
The critics said, do not go and see this work. It's the work of madmen. It's bad for your health. There was a health warning.
One also said they are impressionists in that they do not reproduce a landscape, but convey the impression it makes.
That is what gives birth to the name Impressionism. It wasn't a name that they chose themselves. It was a name that a critic gave them.
And yet in these early works, with their immediacy, their freshness, you can see the stirrings of what was to come. His art might hover over the calm tranquility of nature, an art of gardens, rivers and meadows, but as Monet fought to make it, he was an increasingly tormented figure.
He would physically attack his canvas. He would take a penknife and slash it. He would stamp up and down on his canvases. He would put his foot through it. And he would also set fire to them. People would arrive and witness a kind of bonfire of the canvases as all of the work that he'd been doing for the past day or two went up in smoke.
To develop, Monet would need to get closer to the source of his inspiration, to look ever deeper, to stare ever harder. Although Monet's career was forged here, in the heart of Paris, his own heart was always somewhere else. And in 1883, in middle age, he decided to make a momentous move, which would change the paintings he made for the rest of his life. And it would mark the beginning of an obsession that would lead him to the creation of his monumental water lilies. Claude Monet's grand decorations are a unique masterpiece, a collection of 8 vast panels sweeping across 2 oval rooms. These canvases are the culmination of a nearly 4-decade-long obsession. Water lilies, which in French are called nymphias or nymphs, have become as associated with Monet as, for instance, sunflowers with Van Gogh. And just as those sunflowers would be inspired by Van Gogh's move to the country, so it would be for Monet and his beloved lilies. In 1883, Monet arrived in the small village of Giverny and fell in love with a pink farmhouse, whose woodwork he painted a bright green. This would become a home for him and his growing family for the rest of his life. Plunging into its large, overgrown garden, he could shape nature to feed his art. At Giverny, it's hard to spot where the gardening ends and oil painting starts.
The only time he found he was happy was when he was surrounded by nature and colour.
He planted everything very consciously and created a kind of canvas, a living canvas that he could paint.
And alongside his studio and his work, this would become a busy family home. Monet lived here with his two children, Michel and Jean, and, after the death of his first wife, his new love, Alice Ochde, and her 6 children. His great-grandson, Philippe Piguet, remembers visiting the house as a young boy.
Nous venions souvent ici, tantôt pour venir chercher des œufs, du poulailler, tantôt pour aller pêcher avec mon frère au bassin. Ou bien alors il y avait un autre jeu qui nous plaisait beaucoup, c'était de jouer dans le grand atelier des nymphéas. On s'amusait comme des fous, on était gamins.
The house and gardens that would become Monet's inspiration, his refuge, have remained today exactly as they were when he lived here.
Nous sommes ici dans la salle à manger de Claude Monet. C'est une salle à manger que je connais bien. Petit, j'ai mangé à cette table. C'est là où se tenaient les repas familiaux, une famille assez nombreuse, puisque Monet s'est installé ici à Giverny avec ses 2 enfants et avec Alice Ochde et ses 6 enfants.
It was the beginning of an extraordinarily productive decade. Monet's obsession with nature led to the creation of some of the most famous Impressionist paintings ever produced. From the coast of Normandy to the boulevards of Paris, from cathedrals to cornfields, Monet chose images which spoke to the French people. His painting broke boundaries all the time and was often revolutionary, but above all, he was intensely patriotic. And the world quite quickly caught up with his vision. The artist who'd once been so readily dismissed began to find himself highly in demand.
After the late 1880s, certainly through the 1890s, for the rest of his life, he was really #1. He was extremely popular with the critics, with the public. He was described as having the greatest eye in the history of art, this marvelous gift of the gods. And so it's not just that his prices are very high. He was the most famous painter in the world.
Monet's career flourished. So did his finances. By the 1890s, he had 8 gardeners, and in 1893, he embarked on the project that would come to define him for the rest of his life. His water lily pond.
He had water siphoned off from the river into his garden pond, and this Japanese bridge over it.
He planted irises and tulips, forget-me-nots, roses and wisteria, but it was the water lilies that would win his heart. Finally, he had the perfect subject for his obsession with light, movement and colour.
Il se lève tôt le matin, très tôt. Il prend un bon petit déjeuner et il est au travail dès 8 heures du matin jusqu'à midi. À midi, c'est le déjeuner. On se retrouve en famille, on prend le café, et puis ensuite, à 14 heures, il retourne à l'atelier travailler. Et il revient vers 18 heures, mais il se couche très tôt. Parce que, comme on le dit, qu'est-ce que vous voulez que je fasse une fois que le soleil est couché?
In a letter, Monet wrote, "All at once I had the revelation how wonderful my pond was, and I reached for my palette, and I've hardly had any other subject since that moment." This was his passion project. Over the next 2 decades, he created around 250 canvases of the same pond, unaware that they'd become the inspiration for his great masterpiece to come. I've always been fascinated by this extraordinary and evolving body of work. Monet painted his water lily pond in every season, every time of the day, every kind of weather. He was obsessed by trying to paint what, strictly speaking, can't be painted. Movement. He was trying to capture the unstoppable shifts of light and colour on the surface of the water, what you might call the flicker of the real. Monet's brushwork changed with almost every piece, ranging from bold dashes and confident flourishes to gentle, fluid strokes. At times, he used a palette knife, building up layers to create the illusion of vegetation. 250 paintings of the same thing. Everyone is completely different. And you know, it's not just the time of day or the weather that makes them different, it's the mood as well. So there are kind of dreamy, languorous moments, saturated in light violets and purples. And then there are other paintings which are almost hallucinogenic, as if he was on some kind of drugs. The colours are so strange and so intense and so bright. You think, what was going on there? Nothing has ever looked like that. And there are others, again, where there's just a joyous, gentle, youthful, kind of exuberant, almost adolescent sense of colour. Bright blues, bright whites and reds, just something that makes you feel happy. For more than 20 years, Monet had lived a quiet but intensely productive life, hidden away from prying eyes, making paintings of his pond, his garden, and his family. But then in 1911, this quiet seclusion was brutally ended.
In 1910, Elise was diagnosed with leukemia, and she died in May of 1911. Monet understandably was devastated. Elise truly was the love of his life. And in his letters to his friends, he would say, "I am annihilated. The painter in me is dead, and all that remains is the inconsolable husband."
Cette photo est une photo qui représente Alice Monet. Elle est datée de 1910, 1 an avant la mort. C'est une photo que ses enfants lui ont donnée pour qu'il ait un souvenir de sa femme.
She'd looked after him, she'd been his housekeeper, she'd been his beloved wife. Real love affair, and he just gave up.
More bad news followed. When he finally turned back to painting, he had to accept he could barely see.
His vision had started to become extremely blurred. This, for an artist, was devastating.
And he really felt that this was now going to mark the end of his career.
Monet had developed a cataract in his right eye. The old painter's misfortunes were piling up, and in 1914 he was dealt the cruelest blow of all. His beloved son, Jean, who was just 46, died.
When his son passed away, he took it very badly. It broke him.
He was completely despondent and despairing, probably at his lowest.
He became so depressed that he stopped painting. He couldn't pick up a paintbrush.
And so at the age of 73, after having bestrode the art world for decades at this point, Monet was downing tools.
To him, paint and colour was life, and he was too depressed to go into the studio and paint. He wanted to stay in the sadness so that he could fully mourn for the family that he'd lost.
For more than 60 years, Monet had made art continuously. But now, as grief overwhelmed him, he found he simply couldn't paint. If this master was ever to work again, let alone begin a masterpiece that would consume the rest of his life, It was going to take the intervention of an unlikely friend and further tragedy on an epic scale. In 1914, the world's most famous artist, Claude Monet, essentially stopped painting. Overcome by grief and failed eyesight, his paintbrushes and studio were left untouched until the intervention of a close friend, the former French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. They'd first met in 1860s Paris when Clemenceau was a young journalist and Monet a struggling artist.
The friendship between Monet and Clemenceau survived and thrived despite the fact, maybe because of the fact, that they were opposites in so many ways. If Clemenceau was the fearsome tiger, Monet was what Clemenceau called the hedgehog. And he always needed someone like Clemenceau or like his wife Elise, someone who could support him.
Clemenceau would come to see Monet and chat to him, to lift him up and try and convince him not to be so depressed and to start painting that would cheer him up. And then between them, they discussed this idea that Monet had already had, but between them, the idea became bigger and more grand.
And that project was to radically expand his obsession with the pond and the water lilies.
This is something that Monet had gone back and forth with throughout his life.
He's been painting the water lily ponds for years and years and years.
And Clemenceau said, these are really rather good. And that was all that Monet seemed to need at that point.
This would be more than a painting, it would be an experience in virtual reality.
Le plus important dans ce projet, c'est le concept d'avoir pensé une œuvre à 360 degrés, donc une œuvre dans laquelle le visiteur est invité à être totalement immergé.
It would evoke the experience of standing on the edge of his pond, Giverny.
This would be on a scale Monet had never attempted before. Each canvas would be 6 by 14 feet, and he planned to paint a whole family of them.
This was huge, this project. First of all, he had to paint the canvases in the garden because he didn't have a studio that was large enough. They were put on wheels so he could move them around and see what they looked like together.
He replaced his old dilapidated studio with a new one specially built to fit his huge canvases. This was the greatest artistic challenge Monet had ever taken on, and time was not on his side. The peace and calm of France was shattered as the Great War now engulfed Europe.
Giverny might seem a small, beautiful place, far removed from the Western Front, but in fact, war came to the village and really stayed there throughout the 4 years that Monet was working on his paintings.
Most of the villagers hurriedly abandoned their homes, not Claude Monet.
And Monet said, if the barbarians want to kill me, they'll have to do so in front of my life's work.
He could hear the fighting, he could hear the bombs and the shooting. Within the first few months, so many young soldiers were killed.
The war was personal to him. Giverny was only 50 kilometers away from the front line, and his stepson and his son were both fighting. He was also growing vegetables in his garden, which he would take to the soldiers in the local hospital to make sure that they had nutrition.
With the war in such close proximity, Monet's methods became dramatic, almost frantic. His grief and encroaching blindness produced a frenzy of creativity comparable to Shakespeare in his prime or the last years of Beethoven.
Painting was such an important part of his life that it was also something that can inspire great rages. As with many artists, with great art comes great temperament, and Monet was definitely no stranger to that.
Never before had this prolific artist painted with such urgency and from such a dark, desperate place.
It was all-consuming. He did not stop. That's what he was doing dawn till dusk.
Monet was literally painting these beautiful works of art as France was experiencing the darkest chapters in its history. It was descending into the abyss. 1 million people were dying in France as he was working. And that obviously was on his mind the entire time he was working on them.
But he still felt the same way about his water lilies as he had when he first planted them. "These landscapes of water and reflection have become an obsession for me," he'd written to a friend. "It is beyond my strength as an old man, and yet I want to render what I feel."
The colours became wilder, more outrageous. The brush marks became less controlled.
His subject became smaller. It was all the pond. The only areas of sky and horizon are reflections.
Finally, at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, the pounding of the guns ceased. After 4 long years and millions dead, the war was over. And the following day, the 12th, Monet decided that once his grand water lilies were finished, he would donate them to the French people.
If you travel in France, you will find every small village has a monument to the First World War. It was a searing, traumatic national experience. Monet, too, felt this tragedy and wanted to make this gesture to contribute something that would perhaps help avert war again and at the same time commemorate the sacrifice of a whole generation.
To an old political ally, now France's ferocious wartime Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, he wrote, "It's not much, but it's the only way I have of taking part in the victory." When you think about it, these are a very strange proposition for a war memorial. Most countries get great granite columns or stone arches or heroic soldiers done in bronze. And France, what does France get from Monet? France gets some reflections and aquatic plants. But what Monet, in his wisdom, realized was that grief-stricken, harried, anxious people needed a contemplative, even a philosophical experience. These colossal canvases were meant to speak to the spirit of a nation ripped apart by the most brutal conflict the world had yet seen. But rather than hand them over at the moment they might be needed most, Monet couldn't quite let them go.
Monet never felt that he'd finished his paintings, these grandes décorations that he called them. He always felt he needed to do more. He needed to add a bit of paint here, a leaf there, a petal here.
Monet was a perfectionist, and I don't think he was ever happy with any of his paintings. I think he always felt they could be better. One of the wonderful quotes he has is when he wrote to Clemenceau and said, "When I am dead, I shall find their imperfections more bearable." While alive, he could never accept them, and he could never accept that this was everything that he could do.
8 years after the end of the war, on the 5th of December 1926, Monet died, aged 86. For his last moments, Clemenceau, the radical, patriotic politician who'd become his closest friend, was at his side. And on the day he was buried, a mist descended over Giverny.
As one journalist said, Normandy became a Monet painting, almost as if the elements themselves were paying tribute to the artist who had captured them so beautifully for the rest of the world to see.
Shortly afterwards, his vast panels were transported from Giverny to the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris, where they were installed exactly as Monet had prescribed. There was nothing like them anywhere. The shape of the 2 oval rooms meant those who visited would have no sense of where the cycle of canvases began or ended.
He'd very carefully decided which ones he wanted alongside each other, adjacent, juxtaposed and all in the gallery. They are exactly as he would have arranged them.
We get to see, when we go into those two rooms, an art exhibition curated by Monet himself. These were the paintings that he handpicked.
He wanted people to be surrounded by them, which meant they had to be displayed in a panorama.
What we would describe today as an installation that would be immersive.
What Monet had imagined was a way for the viewer to escape into his world. Monet made these pictures so big for a purpose. They surround you, they envelop you. And because they're so big, you can't simply concentrate on one part of one picture for very long. Your eye is caught endlessly by the next thing. And as you let yourself be surrounded and enveloped by these pictures, you get a sense of timelessness, of endlessness. But as you get lost in the cycle of life, it's almost as if a pattern begins to emerge. After a while, you realize that what's happening as one bit of one picture fades into another bit of another picture, as one color bleeds into another color, every color is changing and morphing and rippling around you, and you realize after a while that these are perhaps the world's only really successful paintings of time moving.
The physical dimensions are really significant. The way in which you walk into an entire architectural space and feel as if you are standing there on the edge of the pond, looking across this surface.
Monet's great installation would finally open to the public in May 1927. But the big question remained, would the world be ready for these paintings? Claude Monet's grand decorations, the culmination of a lifetime's work and his gesture to the French people after the First World War, were finally ready to be unveiled to the world after his death. This was a project that may have taken the artist 12 years, but was the world ready? When Monet's extraordinary waterscapes finally went on display to the public in May 1927, just a few months after the artist's death, they completely tanked.
The reviews were terrible. They said that he had left behind nature, which he had painted so convincingly for much of his career, and begun painting internal impressions instead.
They were really criticised. Oh, scathing criticism. The critics said that he hadn't moved on from Impressionism.
They really saw this as the work of someone who had lost his way artistically and maybe even lost his way emotionally or mentally. Monet's godson wrote that Monet died twice, once in Giverny in 1926 and then a second time with the opening of the Orangerie.
Just as the world hadn't been ready for Monet's first exhibition 50 years earlier, so the same thing happened now. People did not come. Clemenceau was devastated. In June 1928, he observed there wasn't a soul there. As Monet's vast canvases began to gather dust, their tailor-made gallery was taken over for other needs.
The space that was built for them was covered with false walls to show other artworks by other artists and other exhibitions.
There were medieval tapestries shown in front of them. When the ceiling leaked and water dripped on the paintings, nobody really cared.
And they used the room almost like a centre for other activities, dog shows even.
That was humiliating enough. But in August 1944, towards the end of the Second World War, the Orangerie was bombed and Monet's canvases were damaged. It was a catalogue of relentless indignities. With shrapnel from Allied shells buried in the canvases, Monet's grand decorations, the work on which he had driven himself to exhaustion for the last 12 years of his life, were now effectively forgotten. As a final insult to Monet's work, in 1966, the Orangerie acquired a new collection of art. and one of the new gallery spaces was built directly over the room of the water lilies, cutting off these paintings so brimming with life from all daylight with a solid concrete ceiling. And that's how they remained for 3 decades. So, how were these extraordinary paintings rediscovered to the point where they became the most famous water lily images in the world?
Just off Fifth Avenue stands the spanking new home of a nationally important institution, the New York Museum of Modern Art.
The next chapter of this story begins in New York, in the then achingly cool Museum of Modern Art. Inside was one of Monet's water lily paintings, a forerunner to his grand decorations.
While the reaction was negative in Europe, over in New York, people were flocking to see that.
And it was becoming a magnet for a new wave of American artists, the abstract expressionists. They painted big, and they wanted to see the vast canvases that the smaller water lily paintings had inspired.
Every young American painter coming to Paris flocked to the Orangerie to pay homage to the great Claude Monet and to see these paintings that they had been hearing about for themselves. And they were astounded by them.
They absolutely loved them, went back to America and started to paint, inspired by them.
Rothko, Jackson Pollock, de Kooning, artists that could work big, and artists that could use their whole arm to paint with.
Monet, the master of European Impressionism, was now becoming a figurehead for American abstract art.
Monet n'est pas un peintre abstrait, mais il ouvre les portes d'une possibilité de l'abstraction. Et ça, c'est une qualité qui le met au sommet d'une histoire de l'art du XXe siècle.
But although Monet's paintings were resonating with a new generation of artists, the Orangerie itself remained something of an embarrassment. Optimistic visitors couldn't believe the way Monet's grand decorations were being displayed. In 1996, it was finally decreed that the gallery would undergo a $36 million renovation to become a more fitting host to its rediscovered treasure. The responsibility was handed to the architect Olivier Brochet.
Quand nous sommes arrivés la première fois à l'Orangerie, on avait l'impression de descendre à la cave pour aller voir les nymphéas.
Brochet came up with a radical strategy to light Monet's masterpieces in a way the artist had always dreamed of. He decided to remove the concrete ceiling above the water lilies and replace it with a skylight, all without damaging the murals themselves.
C'est un défi technique immense. Les murs que vous voyez, on ne peut pas la déplacer. Et on ne peut pas décrocher ces peintures du mur. Et donc ici, on est en train de construire l'abat-jour pour ramener la lumière. Et les nymphéas, dans les conditions, sont toujours là-dedans, comme celle-là.
Now sitting deep in the heart of a construction site, Monet's canvases had to be protected by specially made cases.
Sur toute l'œuvre, il y avait des palpeurs, tous les 20 cm. Et dès qu'on faisait trop de vibrations au-dessus, il y avait une alerte et le conservateur venait du Louvre et arrêtait le chantier. Très souvent, nous étions obligés d'arrêter le chantier et ça a beaucoup ralenti le chantier.
It took 6 years and almost $40 million, but in 2006, the doors finally reopened. And this time, the public was ready.
You couldn't get more different from the time they were first displayed in 1927. People celebrated, media news went round the world, everyone was queuing to see them.
The paintings were utterly transformed. That space was transformed, and you could finally see the paintings as Monet wanted us to be able to see them, in a kind of natural light, in a beautiful kind of luminescence, which was the sort of light that he strove to paint throughout the course of his entire lifetime.
Notre grande fierté, c'est d'avoir, d'une part, restitué la primauté, la pleine présence de l'œuvre de Monet comme il l'avait voulu, comme il l'avait installé. Elle a retrouvé son esprit d'origine.
Cette incroyable immensité picturale dans laquelle il nous invite finalement à nous plonger et dans laquelle, par le biais de ce bassin, il a capté quelque chose de la beauté du monde. Et c'est là où Monet est un pionnier total.
From being forgotten, they now have a unique importance in the life of this city.
The grand decorations are so special because they were a tribute to the French people. They were a tribute to the war. It wasn't just water and trees. The trees were almost bowing in respect to the Parisians.
It's a temple to art and a temple for modern France.
This whole gallery is devoted to these paintings, and it's what Monet wanted. He wanted it to be a place of meditation, a place of peace, and you see that. You see visitors sitting there peacefully, taking it all on. They're very calming, they're very uplifting. It's an experience, a complete experience.
It's now been nearly 100 years since these epic murals were first hung on the orangery's walls. What an extraordinary journey these canvases have been on, from their traumatic conception to being buried alive and then refound by a new generation. It truly is quite a tale. These aren't really pictures about plants or even reflections. These are pictures of the beauty and transience and therefore the poignancy of human life, indeed all life. None of us are here for very long, but it is gorgeous while it lasts. And that is Monet's message to the French and, thank God, to the rest of us as well. But I don't want to end this as a film about art history. If you possibly can, come and see these pictures for yourself. But please, don't bring a camera. Bring your eyes and your heart, because that is all you need. Next time, the quintessentially English landscape. You want to be there and feel the wind in your face as the clouds scud over your head, which sparked an artistic revolution a long way from home.
French artists cannot believe the originality and the freshness of Constable's approach.
I go behind the canvas of John Constable's Haywain. These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
His watercolours, described as miraculous, people can't believe the effects that he manages to achieve.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? The Louvre, the biggest and the most famous art gallery in the world. It's a colossal museum, covering an area larger than 10 football pitches, holding an extraordinary collection of around 5,000 paintings and nearly 500,000 objects. Every year it's visited by nearly 10 million people. If they all came on the same day, the queue here would stretch to Moscow. But although these buildings are stuffed with tip-top masterpieces, 8 out of 10 people queuing are here to see just one thing. The Louvre's most famous portrait, probably the world's most famous portrait, the Mona Lisa. It's an iconic work of art, once valued at $650 million, but truly, it's priceless. Well, here we are at last, just the two of us, Andrew and Mona. And that is a fantastic privilege, because most of the time, Mona Lisa is facing an endless, snaking queue of admirers shuffling forward for their 15 seconds in front of her, mobile phone in hand, before they have to leave again. What can be seen or selfied is a plainly dressed, enigmatic young woman apparently sitting in front of a mountainous view, all of it demanding close inspection. But I can't get too close, of course, because Mona Lisa is protected by an enormously tough glass box. She is better protected than any celebrity or modern president, and quite right too. She has her own temperature inside there to keep the painting as perfectly as it can be kept after all this time. Now, in a better ordered world, there are other Leonardos which I think deserve to be just as famous. There is a fabulous drawing in the National Gallery in London, for instance, of the Virgin and a child with St. Anne, which is endlessly mysterious and haunting and utterly, utterly ravishing. Then there's another portrait, Lady with an Ermine, which is brighter coloured and much more instantly grabby than this one. And yet it is her smile, her gaze, which has held the entire world mesmerised for decades. So what is it about this picture which has won hearts all over the world? Because in the end, it's just a portrait. A young woman twists her head towards us, peering out of a smoky landscape through cracks and darkened varnish. And that's about it. And yet, she is magnetic. In the flesh, she is captivating. So what's her secret? Or rather, what was Leonardo da Vinci's secret? Well, to unfold the tale of this painting and the astonishing man who created it, we must swap the centre of Western art in the 21st century for the most humming, fashionable and culturally swaggering city of the 15th, the birthplace of the biggest artistic revolution the West has ever seen, Renaissance Florence.
A visitor to Florence in 1459 said Florence is paradise on earth. It was a very prosperous city, but it was also a city with intellectual and cultural life. People enthused about how the Florentines had created a new golden age through painting, through music, through architecture. And so Florence was really a kind of crucible of a new kind of modern life or a new approach to culture.
Whether you were an artist or whether you were a scholar, whether you were interested in the sciences, it was all happening at the same time. It was like the center of the universe.
Renaissance simply means rebirth, a return to the glory days of ancient Greece and Rome. Multi-talented and brilliant minds were drawn here like bees to a flower garden. But in a city of 70,000 people, there was one person who really represents what we now mean by the term Renaissance man. Leonardo da Vinci, the man who painted the Mona Lisa, was born nearby in April 1452.
He came from a two-horse town, or maybe a one-horse town, called Vinci. It's about 20 miles from Florence.
His family were small-time landowners, not incredibly rich. His father was a notary, a lawyer, making his living in Florence. He's listed in his grandfather's tax return. He's listed as a bocca, a mouth, which is rather a nice thing to call your kids their mouths, so they eat a lot of food.
From a very early age, Da Vinci was extremely intelligent, and he went to a very good school, and he showed a great love of anything visual, and he would go out sketching. And apparently he drew with his right hand and wrote with his left hand. You know, so you can imagine him with being so inspired and not wanting to waste a moment that he would be sort of going like this.
His family took note of this precocious ability.
They saw that he had a talent for drawing. And he produced a whole book of drawings, and later on his father took him to Florence to a great artist of the time, Verrocchio, and said, look at these drawings, my son did it. And apparently Verrocchio was just dumbfounded. So I've never seen drawings like this. Are you sure this is your son, and how old is he? And send him to me at once.
For the teenage Leonardo, this apprenticeship with Verrocchio was like a child footballer being coached by Pep Guardiola. A huge opportunity to learn from the formidable Verrocchio.
He's an interesting artist, a major sculptor. His studio produced paintings, and he used senior assistants often to produce the paintings. Visitors to Florence may notice that on top of the cathedral dome, built by Brunelleschi, the great architect, there's a very big bronze ball, and Verrocchio put that up there.
During the nearly 11 years that Leonardo was his student, Verrocchio worked to polish the young man's obvious artistic skills and draw out his immense natural talent. This meant working together on a huge range of commissions from the church and important Florentine families. A major artist in his own right, Verrocchio must have guessed that his student would one day surpass him. But just how soon would that be?
Verrocchio used all of the young painters very wisely in his workshop productions. And one of these paintings is the Baptism of Christ, now in the Uffizi in Florence. And he told Leonardo da Vinci to paint one of the angels in the work, an angel in the lower left-hand corner of the painting.
You look at that angel, the draperies are amazing, the hair is absolutely fantastic. It's very urgent kind of expression, and it seems almost certain that Leonardo did all the fancy oil painting finish in this picture. And the story of one of his biographers is that from that point onwards, Verrocchio said, "I'll never touch a brush again."
From the very beginning, Leonardo was regarded as an unparalleled genius. At the remarkably tender age of 20, the man who would paint the Mona Lisa qualified as a master craftsman, and 6 years later, he received his first solo commission to paint an altarpiece for his local chapel. In gossipy Florence, his reputation was spreading. But this wasn't down to hard graft or even innate skill. When we talk of genius, in Leonardo's case, that meant a hungry appetite for all kinds of knowledge, mathematics, poetry, engineering, hydraulics, optics, measurements of all kinds. And it was his frankly gruesome experiments in anatomy that provide one of the clues to his painting of the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa might be familiar, but she can bring you to your knees. The pride and joy of the world's biggest art gallery, the Louvre. This is the most recognizable painting in the world, produced by history's most influential artist. In all of art history, there has never been anybody remotely like Leonardo da Vinci. Right from the first, when he was apprenticed as a teenager into a workshop, everyone around him thought he was something special. His services were in hot demand from bishops, rival rulers, and the new rich. For the first 30 years of his career, Leonardo moved restlessly through the major cities of northern Italy, most notably Florence, Venice, and Milan, traveling wherever commissions and his curiosity took him.
He had such a short attention span that nowadays they would have said he had ADHD, which fits really because he was always looking for a new inspiration.
This was an artist who really didn't think or paint like any of his contemporaries. Every time he learned something new, he applied it immediately to his latest work.
Leonardo was restlessly experimental, and one of the things that he very quickly became interested in was oil paint, which was a new technology, and he began experimenting with it.
You could create highlights, you could create luster, you could create transparency, you could do veils, you could do atmosphere in the landscape. So he was a great pioneer of oil painting and, in fact, pushed the technique further than anyone had done to that point.
Using this newly developed skill with oil paints, Leonardo created a whole series of works. In 1482, he made Adoration of the Magi. In 1483, The Virgin on the Rocks, and in 1494, he was commissioned by the Duke of Milan to paint The Last Supper for the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. What makes this so revolutionary is not the paint he used, but Da Vinci's first brilliant use of perspective, making a two-dimensional image look three-dimensional. In the history of art, his use of perspective was a radical jump, a different way of thinking that would shape also how he approached the Mona Lisa.
Leonardo was extremely ambitious as a young painter, and one of the things he was very interested in was the application of geometry and mathematics to painting, specifically to create perspective. And so he worked at making his works look more realistic than any painters had done before by creating a kind of three-dimensional image on the two-dimensional plane.
Leonardo's interpretation of the evening before Christ was betrayed by one of his disciples was a monumental undertaking for an ambitious young artist. His experiments with paint mean it hasn't aged well, but his use of perspective made him famous.
The status as an artist in the Renaissance period changed very sharply. Artists acquired pretensions, they acquired a theory of perspective and proportions, and they then claimed to be a liberal art, that is to say, one of the higher intellectual arts.
And this raises the profile of artists and gives them a kind of prominence that they did not have in previous decades or centuries. And what we have then happening is artists become like rock stars.
This was a time that propelled the artist to great stature and celebrity status. If we would have had I'm a Celebrity, they would have been there. It's a time when artists were seen as sort of like mini gods. You know, they had a God-given talent.
Leonardo was a household name elsewhere in Italy, but he'd been away from Florence for 30 years. So when he returned to his hometown in 1500, he needed to establish a reputation here. But first, Leonardo needed somewhere to base himself. Maria Wellington Gattan is a doctor of Renaissance studies.
We're here at the Santissima Annunziata Square with the church sanctuary of Santissima Annunziata behind us. This is thought to be the place where Leonardo first was housed when he came to Florence in 1500. Leonardo's father was a notary for the friars. One could easily imagine that with his connections that he helped Leonardo arrange this housing, because of course Leonardo hadn't been in Florence for the past couple of decades. When Leonardo came to Florence, he came without commissions. So he was looking for work. He certainly would have been interested in painting portraits of the Florentine upper and middle classes.
With a host of potential clients, Leonardo would begin work on the portrait that would define his entire career. But the mystery, for many centuries, was who exactly it was that he'd painted.
The commission for the Mona Lisa has various stories, and each of them are fascinating.
I suppose the most fashionable in the last sort of 20 years of the daft ideas is that this is Leonardo's pupil, Salai, this rascally but rather handsome pupil with curly hair, that it's a portrait of Salai in drag.
Some people said she was his mother. Some people said she was the Virgin Mary or the Duchess of Milan.
Some people say it's a self-portrait of him whilst he's dealing with his homosexual tendencies, and at that time being a homosexual was against the law.
it seems that this extraordinary picture must have an extraordinary explanation, but in fact this extraordinary picture has a sober explanation.
And the sober answer to the mystery is found in where Leonardo was living and in his father's business relationships.
Also connected with the Santissima Annunziata is Francesco del Giocondo. He was a silk merchant in Florence, and we know that he and Leonardo's father knew each other and that they had had business dealings with each other. And so one could very easily imagine Leonardo's father suggesting perhaps that Francesco commission a portrait of his wife, Lisa, from Leonardo.
That this was the case was proved beyond doubt in 2005, when a German librarian found a note written by one of Leonardo's contemporaries, wondering if he would leave the portrait of Francesco del Giocondo's wife, Lisa Gherardini, unfinished. So what do we know about her? She was only 24. She was the wife of a fairly wealthy trader in silks and fabrics, and possibly also in slaves, who was himself a client of Leonardo's father, a notary or lawyer. So they knew the family. It's said that Leonardo used acrobats and musicians and clowns to keep Mona smiling, because it's difficult when you're painting somebody to avoid their face becoming rather frozen with concentration. But if you look closely at her smile, I don't think it's an amused smile particularly. I think it's a sardonic, knowing smile. This is somebody who is staring at us just as hard as we are all staring at her. Perhaps she'd guessed just how long it would take Leonardo to finish his painting of her. After starting in 1503, he never stopped working on this modestly sized rectangle. His magpie mind was far too restless.
He was what I would call a helicopter painter. He hovered endlessly over works of art. He said, art is never finished, only abandoned. You really had to prize a work of art out of his hands.
He was always on the go, always looking for different things. Shall I invent this? Shall I paint that? And that would have been part of his restlessness and also part of his inquiring mind and also his needing and his desire to think outside of the box.
Leonardo's thirst for knowledge was never just confined to painting. He made himself expert in chemistry, botany, mathematics, engineering, music, astronomy, and map-making. But it was another of his obsessions, knowing how things worked, that's the key to the enigma of the Mona Lisa.
Leonardo was one of history's greatest anatomical illustrators, and probably the best, in fact. That was how you would make your reputation in art, by creating very realistic-looking figures that had tremendous anatomical accuracy. And so Leonardo embraced that innovation in painting, and like so many things that he did, took it to the next level. And in fact, he said that anatomy is for a painter what grammar is for a writer. This is the structure on which you build.
The study of anatomy is as old as medicine itself. It was revered in ancient Greece. But in Leonardo's Italy, it seemed new and vaguely sinister. Artists were just starting to see the value of knowing how the human body works by observing the dissection of corpses. Leonardo inevitably went further. He wanted to cut the bodies up with his own hands. In this hospital, the Santa Maria Nuova, even while painting the Mona Lisa, he was likely to be found alongside the working doctors. Maria Antonia Rinaldi is a lecturer in art history.
Leonardo wrote generically that here in the hospital he did 30 dissections. He wrote about the dissection of an old man. Actually, the old man told to Leonardo that he was more than 100 years old, and Leonardo said he passed away in such a serene way that I wanted to understand the reason of such a dolce morte, sweet death. But Leonardo was also interested in trying to understand how the man functioned. The man as a machine, to understand the movement, but then also to understand really how the human being functions.
Leonardo thought that only by knowing exactly what was under Lisa's skin could he begin to capture her essence in paint.
He wanted to see how the muscles were connected to the sinews, to the cartilage, to the bones.
He would not see the dissection as influencing art or art as influencing dissection. He saw them as the same thing in a way. It's a much deeper aspiration for understanding the body than most artists.
This wasn't CSI Florence taking place in a spotlessly hygienic pathologist's lab. To create the Mona Lisa, Leonardo needed to withstand an assault on all the senses.
Leonardo talked about the difficulties in dissecting the body, and he talked about how fast the body decomposed.
There are no preservatives, and this is really gory. You start with the intestines and the abdomen because it decays very quickly. You go to the chest and the brain decays pretty quickly, and the muscles you can leave for a bit later, and the skeleton even later than that. So, yeah, Leonardo writes passionately saying, you know, you've got to have great patience and so on, but you've also got to put up with the sheer unpleasantness of it.
It was a gooey unpleasantness that Leonardo was happy to endure in pursuit of understanding and perfecting his portrait.
He talks about how awful it is to spend the night with these dead men who've been flayed of their skins. And so there are these horrible specters peering out at Leonardo, we have to imagine. But clearly, he was committed to this kind of anatomical study.
He saw painting as remaking nature. So to remake nature, you had to understand nature, not just what something looks like on the surface, but you had to understand what was going on inside.
His curiosity, his appetite of understanding, learning, with such an attention to the detail that his anatomical studies are quite perfect.
Leonardo made reams of notes and drawings about his discoveries, obsessed by the inner workings of the human body. That smile, where exactly were the muscles that moved the mouth and the lips? And how did they combine? For Leonardo, his scientific experiments and his artistic endeavors were inseparable. He was the great connector. There was no reason to keep science and art separate in this life. And so, instead, Leonardo combined the two disciplines. He applied everything he was learning about human anatomy to his art. In this case, the face of the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is the most iconic and most recognizable portrait in the world, the work of an artist of undisputed genius, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was much more than an artist. His insatiable appetite for knowledge of all available kinds spread far beyond the canvas. He was fascinated by things as diverse as mathematics, optics, anatomy, and in particular, human dissection. And quite rightly, he could never separate the science from the art, so that everything he learned in the morgue turned up eventually on the canvas. There aren't many paintings that more or less everyone in the Western world can describe, and analysing it is a joy because Leonardo's extraordinary talent shines through. But once you know that his love of dissection helped to create that famous face, it's hard to see it in quite the same way again. One of the great things about Leonardo is that his drawings and his notebooks show us his mind actually working. And so when we say, oh, he learned from optics in the painting, what exactly do we mean? Well, take the very famous case of the way that Mona Lisa's eyes appear to follow you around the room. That is because the pupil in one eye is looking directly at the viewer, and the pupil in the other eye is slightly off kilter, and that gives the illusion. It became very, very famous. So famous, it's known as the Mona Lisa effect, but it's pure optics. Really close attention to detail produces mystery. Take the case of Mona Lisa's famous smile. Now, if you look directly at her, she doesn't seem to be smiling at all. But if you glance to one side, she does seem to be smiling. And that is because of sfumato, this famous smoky technique that Leonardo uses right at the corner of her lips. After cutting up eyes and studying optical theory, Leonardo recognized that vision is only sharp when we look at things straight on. The eyes can be fooled. By painting extraordinarily fine downward lines at the corners of her lips, he creates the effect. She isn't smiling. Let your gaze widen and the lips blur. The corners appear to lift, her lips change shape. She is smiling. It's almost invisible, and yet it produces the illusion of a mobile, smiling mouth.
There's no hard outlines in the Mona Lisa's face. They're all blurred, so it gives the sense that she's moving. And also, she's not painted directly onto you. She's at an angle. And because she's at an angle, she's showing that she's moving and also showing that she's occupying a three-dimensional space.
I think he was rather pleased when people picked up what he was doing. This very daring recipe of the slightly sideways pose, the direct look. In most cases with female portraits, it was not polite for a woman to engage in eye contact with a man. So you had downcast eyes, you were in profile if you did a portrait. Leonardo breaks that convention.
Leonardo's painting was the closest thing to naturalism that portraiture had yet seen. This was a picture soaked in understanding. Every part of this canvas, from the corkscrew shine of her hair to the details on Mona Lisa's robe, all of those things were achieved by a minute attention to detail. This is, of course, a still image, but she is alive. After spending more than 4 years toiling on this masterpiece, constantly reworking it, changing and tweaking wherever he saw fit, technically, Leonardo was finished, but he would not let it go.
It was very typical of Da Vinci not to finish a work of art. He never felt that he'd made it good enough. He always felt there was more to do, just change this bit and that bit. A lot of artists have this problem, especially if you're a perfectionist, as he was. The family who commissioned the Mona Lisa never got the painting, but they never paid the money either.
As Leonardo kept it with him, few people ever had the chance to see the Mona Lisa, certainly until it went on display in the 19th century. But a small number of Leonardo's contemporaries did get to see her up close and personal, and the impact on them was seismic.
Immediately, the Mona Lisa influenced the way that artists were working at the time.
The artist who probably had the most profound reaction to Leonardo was young Raphael. Raphael painted these two aristocrats, Angelo and Maddalena Doni, and she is absolutely in the pose of Mona Lisa, but doesn't smile.
He clearly had seen the Mona Lisa and could not have painted Maddalena without having seen this work of art. And likewise, his Lady with the Unicorn is almost a complete copy of the Mona Lisa. And so this becomes transformative in portraiture as painters now begin doing their versions of the Mona Lisa.
It may have changed the history of portraiture, but Leonardo was failing to leave his masterpiece alone. Over the next decade, he continued to tweak and finesse it.
An indication of the importance of the Mona Lisa to Leonardo is the fact that he kept it with him throughout the rest of his life. It was something that he really believed was one of the finest expressions of his brush, and he could not let it go. It was something he still wanted to perfect.
Consequently, the image we know and see today is quite different to the original portrait and may indeed be unrecognizable as Lisa del Giocondo.
It's clear from the technical analysis we can now see a lot of the underdrawing. She started off with an orthodox Tuscan dress, and it gradually matured into something which was very decorative with the twisted shawl and so on. And she's put in front of this very remarkable landscape. So it's clear that the portrait becomes what I call a universal picture. Leonardo is pouring knowledge into it about light, about anatomy, about psychology, about geology. Now, nobody much was interested in Lisa del Giocondo outside the family. So it ceases to become a mugshot and becomes something much more universal.
In 1517, with the Mona Lisa nearly always at hand, the 65-year-old Leonardo became an eminent figure in the King of France's court.
He went to work for Francis I. Now, for Francis was trying to buy into the Italian Renaissance. It was the latest thing, and he got the top striker, as it were. Leonardo was expected to do things, but he was a kind of ornament of the court. He had a huge salary, big salary, much bigger than even most courtiers and most civil servants would have had.
But Leonardo would only serve the king for 2 short years. He died in Amboise, in the Loire Valley, in 1519. It's said that he passed away in the arms of the king himself, who was devastated by his death.
Leonardo da Vinci was one of the greatest painters in Europe at this point, and so his death was widely mourned.
And we can say, yes, he finished not many paintings, but he finished the world's most famous painting, the world's second most famous painting, the Last Supper, and the world's most famous drawing, the man in the square and the circle, based upon the writings of the Roman architect Vitruvius. And when people say to me he didn't finish much, I said, well, he finished these 3 most famous things, and that's not bad.
When Leonardo died, the Mona Lisa was bought by the French royal family, and for the next 278 years was moved around among their numerous palaces. It was only ever seen by France's rulers and their most valued courtiers. Finally, in 1797, Leonardo's painting made its way here to the Louvre, where it was displayed with the rest of the former royal collection. And for 114 years, that's where it stayed. To most of its visitors, it was just one more portrait hanging in a crowded gallery. Its place in the world's cultural landscape was frankly about as big as the space it took up on the wall of the Louvre. That is, until the 21st of August 1911, when the painting simply disappeared. Nowadays, people all over the world can identify the Mona Lisa at a glance. It is unquestionably the most famous portrait ever created, endlessly reproduced, and hugely influential all over the globe. But the Mona Lisa's worldwide fame only really began in the 20th century, in 1911, when she made headlines around the globe after she disappeared overnight, upped and offed from her home here in the Louvre. It's a hard-to-believe tale, and it begins on the evening of the 21st of August. With no security measures but locked doors, the Louvre's 400 rooms were guarded by just a handful of men, and none of them saw Leonardo's masterpiece vanish into thin air.
No one noticed for 28 hours that the Mona Lisa was not on the wall.
Paintings were often being removed to be photographed, so that's what staff assumed was happening to the Mona Lisa.
When they discovered it was missing, of course it became enormous news.
Journalists couldn't get enough of the story. Karine Friedberger, a specialist in the history of art, is at the French National Library.
This newspaper is called Le Petit Parisien, and the title says this famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci, La Joconde, Mona Lisa, has disappeared from the Louvre Museum. How? Since when? We don't know. We only have the frame left. And then it takes us through the shock of the personnel in the Louvre Museum, finding this empty space and wondering who could have had access.
Now, for the first time, anyone who bought a newspaper knew about the Mona Lisa. The Louvre was closed for 9 days, and when it reopened, something rather extraordinary happened.
The public reaction was just astonishing. People would queue for hours and hours to go into the Louvre, but they couldn't see the Mona Lisa because it had been stolen, but they just wanted to see the wall space where the Mona Lisa was once hanging.
More people came to see the missing Mona Lisa than actually had been coming to see the Mona Lisa herself in the years before that.
They left offerings by it and notes. People wept when they saw that it wasn't there. It became a bit hysterical.
No one was arrested and charged, and there were no clues to follow. The Paris police force's reputation plummeted. But, by contrast, her disappearance turbocharged the Mona Lisa's fame.
One of the things that happened in the aftermath of the theft is that the Paris police put the Mona Lisa's image, thousands of them, on every street corner in the city. And it gave an incredibly wide exposure to the painting.
This very quickly became a worldwide story. And it so happens that the postcard sellers outside the Louvre made quite a lot of money selling those postcards to visitors who were coming to see the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, and since it wasn't there, they were actually buying the postcards.
And while no end of reproductions were being made, the enigmatic original remained lost. 2 years passed and hope for her return was fading. Then, out of the blue, in 1913, a letter found its way to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, signed Leonardo, and offering to sell the Mona Lisa. The Uffizi's director agreed to meet Leonardo, and in a sting operation, the police swooped and arrested him. The seller's real name was Vincenzo Perugia.
Perugia, an Italian worker who was working at the time in the Louvre, hated the fact that the French had one of Italy's greatest paintings, and it was his prime desire to return it back to Italy. So he went in one night after work, dressed as a workman, and while nobody was about, he took it off the wall and he took it home.
His argument was that he was an Italian patriot and he was returning this painting to the land of its birth because of the fact that he said Napoleon had stolen it from the Italians, which of course did not happen. It traveled to France in the baggage of Leonardo da Vinci himself.
Perugia pleaded guilty to theft, and he served 8 months in prison. With the thief imprisoned and the now world-famous Mona Lisa on her way home, all of Paris was jubilant.
Once it was found and it was brought back, there was like a huge city party, huge carnival.
It's been said that in bars across Paris, can-can girls performed dressed as the Mona Lisa.
People dusted their faces with yellow paint, people shaved their eyebrows and made their hairline bigger to look like the Mona Lisa.
Back in the Louvre, the Mona Lisa's place in the history of art had been secured forever.
And she became a celebrity, even so much so that even now the Mona Lisa has her own postbox, allegedly. She gets mail.
And that new global fame made the Mona Lisa into the Marilyn of the early 20th century. A new cultural icon had been born. Everyone wanted to see the small, famous painting in the flesh, and her travels on loan abroad were treated like a royal tour, prompting a semi-hysteria wherever she went.
Now, as befits a lady more renowned than any queen, Mona Lisa leaves the Louvre under heavy guard for a trip to the United States.
Whenever the French government needed a little hand with some foreign relations, the Mona Lisa could be lent out to help oil the wheels.
No VIP has been surrounded by more security. The Secret Service has been ordered to stand guard over the lady with the enigmatic smile 24 hours a day.
While she was on display in New York, nearly 2 million people queued to get a 20-second or so glimpse of her. Similar numbers flocked to see her wherever she went in the world before officially retiring, exhausted, to the Louvre in 1974, where she's remained its biggest attraction ever since.
Mona Lisa is the best-known image in the world. There really is no rival. I've seen her twice out of the frame, and it has a kind of living presence. It has a sort of breathing presence. This sounds very pretentious, but there's no other way to describe it.
It's quite incredible that she remains up there, bigger than any other work of art. Nothing has usurped her. She's remained the greatest celebrity portrait that we know.
That's the extraordinary draw of the Mona Lisa. She's a global phenomenon, seems to smile at everyone, wherever they are, all over the world.
The Mona Lisa just does not belong to the Louvre and the French state or to Leonardo da Vinci. The Mona Lisa belongs to the world. This is part of the cultural heritage of all of us because it's such a wonderful work of art.
The story of the Mona Lisa and Leonardo da Vinci, the genius who painted her, has blockbuster bestseller dimensions. The autopsy, the optics, the explosion of new thinking in Renaissance Italy, a gay artist's decade-long obsession with a 24-year-old girl, her journey across the Alps to France, the theft, the return, the global fame. It is all a great story, but frankly, it means nothing compared to this, the fact that the hairs on the back of your neck stand up in her presence, that gaze, that smile. Fundamentally, this is not a portrait of a particular person. This is a picture of humanity by one of art's great geniuses, clothed in beauty and brimming with inner mystery. It may be dark, it may be old, it may be quite small, and it may be over-familiar, but it is without doubt one of the world's great paintings. Next time on the world's greatest paintings, a canvas so blindingly famous it sets the National Gallery ablaze. This is one of the brightest pictures you will ever see. This is a story of heroic optimism.
Nobody had ever done anything quite that wild.
Loneliness.
His family, I think, started to realise the madness had begun.
And heartbreak.
He thought it was going to be a whole new beginning for him. And of course, it wasn't to be.
Behind Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers. These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? All around the world, there are great galleries and museums crammed with beautiful art, which are open to everybody, free to all of us. Sometimes that's because of an act of national determination. Sometimes it's because of an individual bequest or legacy. When this one Tate Britain opened its doors first in 1897, it was the gift to the British of a Liverpool sugar merchant. Sir Henry Tate's great thing was sugar cubes, but his other great thing was British art, and he wanted to share his obsessive love of it with the rest of us. Tate began this gallery with 65 of his own fine and memorable paintings, and at the heart of that collection there was one particularly special piece. It's been famous since before the gallery was built, and it's still its most popular picture. The Victorians loved it, and so do we. It is luscious, gorgeous to look at, but this is not a pretty story. It's a young, disturbed woman's suicide by drowning. I'm talking, of course, about John Everett Millais' Ophelia. You'd need to be a cold fish not to be moved. Simultaneously beautiful and deeply shocking, Ophelia is the crowning achievement of one of the most skilled and ambitious painters of Victorian Britain. Millais was considered an absolute genius with a paintbrush. He could do almost anything. Flowers fresh, flowers drenched and drowning. Little touches of sunlight on leaves, a face perfectly rendered, wet hair sinking into the water. Others had painted Ophelia before, but nothing like this. It isn't stagey or really melodramatic. Here is a real woman, briefly suspended in living water, almost ecstatic in her despair. So who was this doomed and dying figure? How was Ophelia captured on canvas, and why does this image still hold such an important place in one of the greatest art collections in the world? To really understand this image, we have to go back to the very beginnings of its life, because behind the romantic scene lies a much darker and more revolutionary story. It's a tale of a major artistic rebellion, of ruthless ambition and Victorian macabre. But before all of that, we start decorously in a far more conventional setting, just 2 miles from where Ophelia now hangs, in the place that mattered most to any aspiring Victorian painter, the Royal Academy of Arts. It was here, in December 1840, that an extraordinary young painter was first introduced to the Victorian art scene.
Millais was a child prodigy. He went to art school at a very young age, and he got into the Royal Academy when he was just 11 years of age.
He was the youngest ever person to attend the Royal Academy as a student. Prior to that, the youngest had been Turner, who went at the age of 14, which in itself was quite prodigious.
That's a record the young Millais still holds today. The Royal Academy was the only place to gain an art education. But to survive there, the young prodigy would have to bend himself to its rigor, its traditions, and above all, its taste.
You were told very much what you had to do, what paint palette you were allowed to use, what subject matter was appropriate for the stage of your learning.
You were meant to be painting portraits, landscapes, genre painting, often perhaps with some kind of moral tale.
Many artists were frustrated by the fact that the teachings of Joshua Reynolds, who died in 1792, were still being taught as the only way to look at art.
But even with these traditionalist teaching techniques, from the beginning, Millais' exceptional eye for detail, the very skill that would shine through in his Ophelia, won him fame and applause.
Millais was a great success at the Royal Academy. Even though he only went in when he was 11, he was winning awards and medals for his drawings and his paintings.
There's a wonderful picture with the Duke of Sussex handing the young Millais his silver medal, and he can hardly see Millais because he's so small. He has to bend down to this little boy who's shown with his lovely gold hairs and his little pantaloons.
Millais excelled at history paintings, big canvases depicting moral themes from well-known stories of the past. In 1846, he exhibited Pizarro seizing the Inca of Peru, and 1 year later, at just 18 years old, he received a gold medal for his painting The Tribe of Benjamin Seizing the Daughters of Shiloh. By the men at the top, he was adored, and yet, behind its closed doors, Millais was becoming increasingly frustrated with this cramping institution. Revolutions in art tend to happen after a time of stagnation. And in the 1840s, British painting was frankly in a poor way. Most of the greats, including Constable, were dead. And apart from the elderly Turner, then thought to be in his decline, there was nobody for the young Millais to look up to, which was a great stroke of luck, because it meant he had to rely on his own resources, think harder, and make his own way. Well, I say his own way, but not entirely, because in a second stroke of luck, he was surrounded by a group of equally impatient and almost as talented friends. Two other young artists, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and William Holman Hunt, shared Millais' frustrations with the revered Royal Academy.
They began to be rather critical. They felt that all the students were coming out and they were producing these rather brown, lacklustre paintings, which had no real connection to the society in which they were living.
Unlike all artists, they wanted to go their own way. They wanted to show their own talent.
So in 1848, the trio vowed to work together, igniting an extraordinary period of creativity. Aged just 19 years old, the teenage Millais was about to transform the story of British painting forever and create an image that would shock the mid-Victorian establishment. John Everett Millais' Ophelia is one of the oldest and most popular pieces in Tate Britain's collection. This painting is so photoreal, so throbbing with vivid, lush colour, that it's hard to remember it owes nothing at all to any camera or lens, but was painted meticulously by hand in the depths of Victorian London more than 150 years ago. It packs an immediate punch. It looks different because it was meant to look different. It was the product of an artistic plot or conspiracy, if you like, that shook the Victorian art world. And it all began in the summer of 1848 in this small, nondescript house in central London, with three daring young chancers, all under the age of 22. John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and the hot-headed, flashy painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti.
So these are young rebels. They want to cause a stir, a reaction, and they are defiantly rejecting what they had been taught by an older generation.
They called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and even the name was a provocation. The now stale influence of the great Renaissance master Raphael was being cast off by the bold young radicals as a counter-revolution of spirituality based on naturalism now began.
It was very brave of the PRBs to do what they actually did, forming themselves and going against the Royal Academy, but they really believed in themselves.
These young artists who knew they were going to be provocative and they were going to be shocking to the public named themselves PRB, the little initials in the corner, so it's almost like a secret society.
A lot of academicians were really upset and they were quite shocked. You know, we've trained these students and this is what they're producing. They're rejecting us. These artists dismissing these time-honoured conventions of painting.
Within weeks, more like-minded young artists, fascinated by this radical new approach, joined Millais, Rossetti and Hunt. In their paintings, the rebellion unleashed an entirely new palette, paving the way for Millais' Ophelia.
The Pre-Raphaelite movement was revolutionary because their pictures just looked so different to everything else on display. The works were vivid and bright, with colours placed in juxtaposition.
They tried to show things as they really were. One of their tenets was truth to nature. So they would go outside, they would paint in the open air, and they would faithfully record everything that they saw. This was hugely radical.
So their pictures did actually look different, and they immediately demanded attention.
This revolutionary new society made their first big splash with Millais' attention-demanding Christ in the House of His Parents. Now displayed in Tate Britain, it's one of the artist-educator Richard Thomas's favourite pieces.
It went on show at the Royal Academy annual exhibition in May 1850, and he was 20 years old. So this is his coming-of-age exhibition. The first thing that happened for people looking at it was that they were drawn into responding to the subject in the painting as if it was an incident in a perfectly ordinary carpenter's workshop. But that's not just a little boy who's cut his hand. This is the Holy Family with Mary, Jesus, and Joseph, and Mary's mother, St. Anne.
Everything about this painting reflected the new and almost extremist principles of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
Millais decided to paint the picture not in his studio, but on location in an actual carpenter's workshop in order to get the authentic feel. To get the effect of the vivid blood, Millais actually cut his own hand. You can see the chipped and dirty toenails of St. Joseph.
He thought this was one of his masterpieces. And until this time, Millais had been adored, so he didn't expect to really get a backlash. But in general, people took against this painting. One of the biggest problems was that Millais had portrayed the Holy Family as working class. This was really, really shocking to people. They didn't like it.
It's failing to do what people expect of a religious painting. It's failing to illustrate the sacred text. It's inserting an additional story. It's daring in a number of ways.
The Virgin Mary is not represented as some beautiful Raphaelesque type. She's shown as a woman who looks rather sort of haggard and grief-stricken. It would seem to be blasphemous.
Ignoring all the pallid Madonnas and cute Christs that had come before him, Millais' religious realism was entirely unexpected. The Victorians already had a mental image of the Holy Family, and they hadn't looked like this.
One of the biggest critics of this particular painting was Charles Dickens. Now, Dickens was not an art critic. However, he had an awful lot of sway.
And his criticism is utterly hostile. He describes the Christ child as a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy with a bedgown. The Virgin is described as a kneeling woman so horrible in her ugliness that she would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest cabaret in France or the lowest gin shop in England. So he's utterly dismissive of this coarse realism.
The Pre-Raphaelites may only recently have been founded, but thanks to Millais, their reputation was already shot to pieces. News of the scandal even reached Queen Victoria, who demanded to see Millais' blasphemous work for herself. The young artist was devastated.
After the shock of the reception of Christ in the House of His Parents, Millais was determined to make the art world love him again, to get his reputation back. He wasn't going to compromise, but he was going to make sure that his next painting was adored.
And for that, there was no better place for Millais to turn than the theatre.
Theatre was very popular. When people went out for entertainment, they went to the theatre, and Shakespeare was extremely popular.
It was a bit of everything that the Victorians liked. There was death involved, there was love involved, a bit of almost eroticism.
The Victorian public adored their Shakespeare. Even those who couldn't read had been to the theatre and were well versed in his stories. So as a topic for story painting, Shakespeare was a shrewd choice, especially as Millais plucked out one of the most dramatic moments in one of the most popular plays of them all. So this is the famous moment in Shakespeare's Hamlet when Hamlet's beloved Ophelia decides to kill herself. She has been driven mad because Hamlet appears no longer to love her and has been mocking her in a rather cruel way, and he has just killed her father. So for her, life is over.
It was a really popular subject with artists. A lot of artists known to Millais, Arthur Hughes, Richard Redgrave, had painted the death of Ophelia. But they'd done it in a picturesque way, where she's sort of just tripping over the bank and stepping into the water.
Millais, however, took a closer look at Shakespeare's immortal lines. Her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto the element, but long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. Snatches of old songs, the waterlogged dress, inconsolable in her misery. Bound by the Brotherhood's rules, Millais wanted to bring all of this vividly to life. But to do that, he needed the perfect poor wretch, a model whose face he dearly hoped would become unforgettable. The answer to his Ophelia was a young hat seller called Lizzie Siddal.
Lizzie Siddal was working in a milliner's shop just off Leicester Square in London, and she was a rather unusual-looking woman for her time. She was a young woman who was very, very slim.
Long red hair, very pale skin, very tall. She was discovered by Millais' friend who went to the milliner's and saw her and just thought she'd be perfect for the Pre-Raphaelites. And she became their model. But she was also an artist in her own right.
She was quite intellectual and loved poetry, painting.
Rossetti loved her, Millais loved her. Everybody wanted to paint her.
She essentially became the Pre-Raphaelite supermodel.
Millais now had his Ophelia, but how would he transform a 22-year-old Victorian hat seller into his doomed Shakespearean? How could he bring his canvas to life unless his model lived and breathed her distress? Ophelia and her watery suicide had to feel real. It was the beginning of a painstaking process as carefully planned as any military maneuver.
It wasn't just the figure that was important, so like Ophelia. The background was just as important.
The scene in Hamlet takes place in a remote corner of Denmark, but Millais needed somewhere a little handier for central London. Today, his great-great-grandson, art historian Dr. Roger Bowdler, is retracing Millais' steps for the first time.
Oh, my goodness. It's just a fabulous feeling, actually, having found the precise spot where he spent weeks and weeks and weeks in the summer of 1851 painting Ophelia, and it's here. And this isn't the most romantic or glamorous of settings. You know, you can hear the M3 in the background, it's in the edge of Greater London, and it's covered in litter. But actually, that almost makes the magic of the picture the greater. The drama is about her imminent sinking below the water. So he doesn't want a grand, picturesque setting. He wants rather a modest riverbank to paint, and that's just what he finds.
To work outside, Millais capitalized on two exciting new innovations: small portable paint tubes and a host of new pigments and colors. His Ophelia would be the brightest canvas he'd ever produced, but working for so long outdoors still brought with it a whole catalogue of challenges.
He would spend up to 11 hours a day in great discomfort. He complained about the flies, about being threatened by a big bull.
He had farmers shouting at him. People would come past and ask him what he was doing.
And he has to deal with this pair of swans. They take up station just where he's found his spot and completely muck up the water weeds that he's so carefully selected for the setting of the painting.
Millais wrote, "My martyrdom is more trying than any I have hitherto experienced. Certainly, the painting of a picture under such circumstances would be a greater punishment to a murderer than hanging." These were the lengths the Pre-Raphaelites were willing to go to in order to capture nature as truthfully as possible.
He paints with fantastic finesse, which is why it takes him so long. So he begins work on this in early July. He's still here in early December.
He would say that it was like completing the size of a 5-penny piece each day. So that gives you a sense of how slow and gradual this process was.
He's putting his all into it because his reputation depends on success. So there's a discipline at work, along with the very romantic, poetic engagement of this poignant scene of watery death in this river.
But while Millais himself was more than happy to suffer for his art, even he realized that persuading Lizzie to dunk herself for hours in the cold and dirty waters of a Thames tributary might be going a little too far. And so back in central London, he came up with a somewhat less unpleasant alternative, but only somewhat.
Millais poses her in his studio, in his parents' house, in a bathtub, and he finds in an antique shop a beautiful antique dress with silver embroidery. Elizabeth Siddal is posed wearing this in the bathtub.
Now, Lizzie was being painted in December, long before central heating, and it was cold. It was in a basement studio. The lamps underneath the bath were kept lit in order to keep the water at an even temperature. But one day, Millais didn't notice that the lamps had gone out. The water, of course, just got colder and colder, and Lizzie lay there, the perfect artist model, suffering for his art as he completed his picture.
Millais' quest for realism had given his muse pneumonia. But although he was forced to pay for Lizzie's doctor's bills, there may have been a dark part of him that was quietly and privately pleased.
I think that the fact that Lizzie Siddal did suffer whilst posing did inject that extra sense of realism and naturalism to the face that he painted while she was lying there in the bath, freezing.
Millais had thrown everything at this piece, stretching himself to the limits of his already extraordinary abilities. And yet it had almost cost the life of his model, and even after months of toil, he still wasn't finished. This was perhaps his last chance to not only save his reputation, but that of his fellow Pre-Raphaelites. So would his Ophelia be the great hit that Millais craved? John Everett Millais' Ophelia, the jewel in Tate Britain's collection, may be one of the most popular pieces of art of the 19th century, but it's definitely not for everyone. There is something about this picture, perhaps its extreme prettiness, a dash of sentimentality that does not quite work for me. Perhaps I'm already too old. That is, when I first started looking at paintings and loving paintings back in the 1970s, modernism was all the rage, and Victorian pictures telling stories were deeply unfashionable. But we all have to challenge our prejudices, don't we? And it may be strange thought, unlikely thought, that I am completely wrong. And with this iconic canvas and its exquisite detail all to myself, it's very hard not to appreciate the sheer artistry. So first of all, this is about two things for which the Pre-Raphaelites are very well known. Rich, luscious, almost enameled colour, and a detail so sharp you could cut your fingers on it. Where in the history of art have you ever seen a green as greeny as that green? Not since the very early Renaissance, I think. It is absolutely gorgeous, and the detail of the foliage is extraordinary. At times, he must have been using a brush with a single hair. And so, yes, perhaps, I may have been a little hasty. Looking again with fresh eyes, the subject is creepy, but it's impossible not to admire the way Millais makes his colours glow and his brushes dance. A touch of blue here, a flicker of white there. He applies shades and highlights with nerveless accuracy.
He managed somehow, with the rest of the Pre-Raphaelites, to wash and rinse the colours so they glowed more freely and brightly than they had for a very, very long time. And they astonished the Victorians, and frankly, they are still astonishing us today.
There is this remarkable kind of hyper-real quality in the painting. And one of the ways he achieved this effect was to use a white ground, using lead white and zinc white. And the effect of that was to create this kind of backlit quality to these very bright primary colors that he's using.
And the wonderful passages of observation, those two hands, which will stand out like pieces of collage on the canvas. And it really conveys the impression of, this water just sinking into the dress. It's just dragging her bit by bit under the water.
The Pre-Raphaelites' hopes for a new art live in every inch of this canvas. It throbs with zest and confidence. It is everything the movement had hoped painting could be. It took Millais months, but finally, in early 1852, Ophelia was finished.
The question for Millais was now, was it worth it? Would the Victorian public feel half as strongly about this astonishing picture as did the artist himself?
When the painting went on display at the Royal Academy in 1852, there was a very mixed reaction, actually.
Some people thought it was a very unconventional representation of Ophelia. Someone described her death as if she were in a weedy ditch. Others felt it was just too bright, vivid and gaudy.
There was so much going on, so much symbolism, that viewers almost had to work at it. They had to study it really hard. And at first, people were a little bit shocked, but within a very short time, it was applauded.
People thought Millais has really captured something quite extraordinary. Tom Taylor, who wrote for The Times, when he saw the face of Ophelia, he just described himself as just crying with emotion because he'd made the death so beautiful.
Millais' masterpiece had been quickly snapped up by a private collector, but while it remained on public display, Ophelia proved to be a huge draw. And whether they liked it or not, the Royal Academy could no longer cast out its arrogant prodigal son.
The painting is really important in terms of Millais' career. It marks a watershed. Suddenly, his paintings become emotional, and he becomes seen as a painter of pathos and empathy. And there are accounts of people just become overcome with emotion at seeing Ophelia. And at that point, his reputation changes. And from this point onwards, it's really an upward trajectory.
Just a year after Ophelia was displayed, Millais was chosen as an Academy Associate, an act which would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. The establishment he had rejected and which had loudly rejected him was suddenly embracing the stiff-backed young radical. But if Ophelia had been about tapping into popular taste, then, unfortunately, Millais now didn't know when to stop.
So from 1853 onwards, Millais starts to feel that he doesn't have to stick entirely to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's principles. He sticks to a lot of them, but he starts to experiment.
He becomes a highly successful commercial artist, a painter of genre scenes, of landscapes. His style relaxes, but also I think he becomes just bored, dissatisfied with that Pre-Raphaelite, very finicky manner. He wants to develop as an artist. Artists always have to change and evolve.
He became a fashionable portraitist, painting rich people's portraits, and a lot of artists said that he sold out, but he was making a living.
Most of the public just loved him. They couldn't get enough of Millais. He started to paint a lot of crowd-pleasing pictures, often of little children, because that was the fashion.
He becomes the darling of the British public.
A revolutionary no longer, Millais' later work, which even included a saccharine advert for Pear's soap, bore no relation to his Pre-Raphaelite canvases. He became firmly part of the establishment. In 1896, aged 67, he was even elected Royal Academy President. But whereas Ophelia had once represented the peak of the Pre-Raphaelite movement in all its non-conformist glory, now it marked the beginning of their demise. Holman Hunt and the increasingly eccentric Rossetti would be left to forge their own paths, and their great muse Lizzie, immortalized in their paintings, would begin a terrifying parallel trajectory in real life. Millais' painting had almost killed her, and now she was going to become Ophelia-like in an entirely new way.
People clamoured to come and see this painting. And in fact, for Lizzie Siddal, in some ways it was a double-edged sword. She became very famous because of it.
Through her association with Rossetti, she really begins to pick up her art again, painting and drawings, often portraying scenes of lovers or couples in complicated psychological situations. She also starts to write her own poetry and verse.
Lizzie was a sophisticated Pre-Raphaelite artist in her own right, much more than the model in the movement's most iconic piece. But her relationship with Rossetti was incredibly tempestuous. He was a serial cheat, and Lizzie didn't make the easiest partner herself.
Perhaps the biggest problem in their relationship on her side was that she was a laudanum addict. And laudanum was an opiate. It was opium in alcohol, incredibly addictive. And it was a real social ill of the 19th century, particularly amongst women.
Depressed, unappreciated, and darkly miserable, Lizzie could not control her addiction. And tragically, on the 11th of February, 1862, aged just 32, she killed herself with a suspected overdose.
People have often associated the tragic early death of Elizabeth Siddal with the early death of Ophelia. So there is this conflation between art and life. That's what's so sort of magical and sort of, slightly sort of sinister or uncanny about Pre-Raphaelite paintings. Often art and life do converge.
When Lizzie was buried, Rossetti did a very romantic gesture. He placed in her coffin, between her cheek and her hair, his only copy of his poems that he'd written. He claimed that they were all about her, that love had died with her. He was deeply grief-stricken.
With Ophelia sold and in private hands, the Pre-Raphaelites disbanded, and Millais now creating mainstream art for the masses, it looked as if the importance and significance of this remarkable painting would start to fade.
But neither Lizzie Siddal nor Millais' Ophelia were going to be forgotten, because something was about to happen in that graveyard which would lodge the young model and the painting deep in the Victorian popular imagination.
Millais' great canvas, Ophelia, has continued to capture our imagination almost 170 years since it was first exhibited. And I think that's in part because its subject matter transcends any age or any era.
There is no moment in the human story so cold, so lonely, and so bleak as deciding to take your own life. Ophelia killed herself because she had been so badly betrayed she was demented. And she did it in a particularly grim way.
But what also added to the intrigue, mystery, and perhaps the popularity of this canvas was that it was an act reflected by the untimely death of Millais' own muse. And Victorian Britain would be aghast at what happened next.
Lizzie Siddal was buried in Highgate Cemetery, Rossetti's handwritten poetry tucked neatly behind her long flowing red hair. But this tragic woman was not going to be allowed to rest in peace, because just 6 years later, Rossetti decided that he wanted his poetry back, which was tricky, because you could hardly dig her up again. Or could he?
By 1869, Rossetti couldn't bear the thought of his Pre-Raphaelite poetry being lost to the world any longer. And so alongside his friend Charles Augustus Howell, he hatched a macabre plan to retrieve the poems from Lizzie's grave.
They'd done it by bonfire light, and the coffin had been exhumed and the lid had been taken off. And allegedly, according to Howell, there was Lizzie, perfect. She wasn't a skeleton, she was miraculously preserved. He claimed that her hair had grown so much it filled the whole coffin. Rossetti wanted to believe it, that Lizzie was the beautiful supermodel in death, just as she'd been in life.
Rossetti published the poems, which he'd received with a wormhole running through them. They didn't go down well. By the time he died 13 years later, he was a thin spectre of the man who'd helped found the Pre-Raphaelites back in 1848. And yet, a mythology began to grow around the image of Lizzie, captured for eternity as the epitome of the betrayed woman.
She's sort of a heroine for women that suffered at the fate of drugs and men and being a muse.
A lot of women now model themselves on Elizabeth Siddal, and the Elizabeth Siddal look is now rather fashionable. If you think of performers such as Florence Welch with the red hair, pale complexion, the flowing garments.
Perhaps one reason why Lizzie Siddal still captures the imagination is that her own suicide is so neatly captured in the painting of her by Millais as Ophelia. The fact that she was the most famous suicide in art history and then becomes a suicide in real life is something that continues to resonate with people.
There's no denying this is a great Victorian horror story. But Lizzie Siddal, the face of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, should not be remembered just as a beautiful victim.
We look at Lizzie Siddal in this picture, and she is entirely passive, almost surrendered. And we have to remember that this was a woman who, in her real life, was an artist and a writer, a poet herself. It is a great, great injustice that the way we remember her is only as a passive, sinking woman in a famous painting and as a corpse being ravaged for somebody else's poetry long after her death.
And yet, even now, Lizzie couldn't quite rest in peace. The painting of Ophelia had vanished into the private art world not long after it had been completed. But now it had reached the eye of one very important man.
In 1892, Henry Tate purchases the picture. Henry Tate is a sugar magnate. He's made his fortune from sugar refining. He patents the sugar cube.
There was only one thing that Tate loved more than sugar: art, and in particular, Pre-Raphaelite art. Over the last few years, he'd collected an extraordinary number of paintings. And now, he wanted to share them with the nation.
He loved the idea of a national gallery that people of all social classes could go to.
A site is decided upon, which is the old Millbank Penitentiary. It's a site which will be transformed into this public gallery, which will be free of charge for the public, particularly for the working poor of the Millbank area.
A cutting-edge art gallery in one of the poorest areas of the city. That was a mighty risk. The question on everyone's lips was, would Ophelia help pull in big crowds? And the answer was a resounding yes.
The gallery opens in 1897, and Ophelia is an immediate hit with the public. People flock to see it.
It was one of those that people were told to sort of stand back, don't jostle. They had to have a lot of guards checking that people didn't get too close to the painting. And it's remained one of the most successful paintings of the Tate ever since.
This haunting canvas has spoken to generation after generation since it was first hung here more than 120 years ago.
Millais' Ophelia is a masterwork by a master painter. He was a young revolutionary taking on the establishment, And then, very quickly, the perils of success. He became the establishment himself, and he was much mocked for turning out cute, sentimental pictures, some of them used in advertising as sweet as any sugar cube manufactured by Sir Henry Tate himself. But this here still shows all his defiance and his optimism. It is a young man's shout hanging on these establishment walls. No, I still don't love it, but I salute it for its vividness and its energy. And anyway, Ma, you old fool, the rest of the world disagrees.
Next time.
This was a painting that was not supposed to be seen by the public. It was private art, strictly for behind closed doors.
The story of a ravishing beauty and the revolution she stirred.
He would have put it on the bonfire and watched it burn.
This could only be Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus.